In this lesson, I want to consider the idea of implementing screen-based rules in Sage CRM. We'll have met this diagram before in the introduction to JavaScript. Let's remind ourselves about how everything inside Sage CRM works together. The user interface inside Sage CRM is presented to the user as HTML, and obviously the user is using a browser. And that's, if you like, the presentation layer. And that's run client-side, it's inside the browser. We also have an application layer which runs inside the web server. This is where all of the business rules are implemented inside Sage CRM. It's where the DLL sits, it's where the interaction with the Tomcat architecture sits. It's where most of the rules and processes are implemented within inside Sage CRM, and then we also have a database which is responsible for storing the business data and the metadata which describes the system. And of course, inside Sage CRM we're using a web application, and just remind ourselves, if we click a hyperlink or we submit a form, then what we're doing is we're sending an HTTP request from a browser to the web server. And when that happens, Sage CRM responds by assembling the HTML that is then returned to the browser. Now, we have considered in another video some screens that look at different types of scripts that can be added into a screen. We know actually that we can add in create, on-change and validate scripts into individual screens. When a screen, like the case screen, is requested from the browser, the field definitions for that screen are pulled from metadata. This happens, it triggers each of the fields to fire their create scripts. The create scripts are executed on the web server inside the Sage CRM application area, so their create scripts are always fired server-side. Now, these create scripts can change the properties of fields, and that means the behavior of the fields, how they look, how they act, in fact, whether they should be included, whether they're mandatory, etc. Now, if they're changing any of the properties of the fields, then this means that they can change the HTML that is ultimately delivered into the browser. And within the browser, when a screen is changed into edit mode, then we can understand that on-change scripts will fire when they detect the value in the field is altered. But all of that takes place inside the browser. So on-change scripts fire inside the browser. But once we've changed and corrected some data, then we may want to implement that into the database. And what we would do is then submit the form as another HTTP request. So if we're submitting that as an HTTP request, then that's fired inside the server. So each field within the screen can have a validate script associated with it. The validation or validate rule checks the quality of the data to make sure that the data doesn't break any business rules. And if the data is not good, then the validate rule will block the insertion into the database. So that's the idea of it being a restrictive rule. Now, all of those types of scripts are part of a complex of business rules that can be implemented. So these can include things like workflow, table-level scripts, and time-based notifications and escalations. And those other types of business rules can also interact with the same data that the field-level scripts are interacting with. Now, we'll be looking at those other types of rules later on in the lessons associated with the advanced customization skills. So I'm only going to concentrate now in this lesson on create scripts. Within each of the scripting environments, we're going to be using the same coding language. That same coding language is, of course, JavaScript. Now, the script runs in different environments, and because it's running in different environments, there are going to be greater or lesser differences in the way in which we can access objects and control the system. One of the first big division between the types of code is whether the code is external to Sage CRM or internal to Sage CRM. Examples of external implemented code is whether they are ASP pages used for application extensions or whether they're self-service. So that's where you're having to externally register the CRM object to use it in an external script rather than having implicitly available. And we'll be looking at this in later lessons. The code that we're interested in now is executed within the server itself, and it's very similar when we're dealing with create, validate and table level scripts, but even here there are going to be some slight differences in the way in which the core CRM API objects can be used, can be referenced and can be controlled. So there are limitations in each scripting environment that we're working in, and each script has a scope of reference and a scope of effect. The scope of reference is concerned with the idea of what objects are available to the script, what access does the system have to the database, thinking about the environmental information, that's the information provided by the server and the browser, what about that environmental information can be accessed by the script. The scope of effect is concerned with the action that the script can perform. So what can it change in both the field or the screen in which that script is run, and what data can it change within the system? This slide is showing some information that has ultimately come from the documentation. So the create script can use the internal API, and the objects within the API that make sense for create scripts to use are essentially focused on data access. These are objects that allow data to be retrieved from the system and data to be potentially changed. We can also access the properties of the field itself, and we can also see that there are some system variables that are of a special use. And we're going to see in a moment how the valid and error string system variables can help with things like debugging. We can also look at how we can get hold of environmental and information by using the values and form values methods. And we'll consider questions about screen mode and consider the difference between coding in a field in a screen versus a column in a list as well. Let's just remind ourselves about JavaScript. It's used for all of the internal scripting that we're doing. That's internal scripting is the field level, which are the create and validate and table level scripts. We'll see in one of the other lessons, one of the other videos, that JavaScript is implicitly used on change scripts, and we're able to work with the objects that are available to us. Now I've switched back into Sage CRM and I want to look at a URL that's displayed. Now the whole idea about a URL changes as you move through the system, and it's collecting more information within the URL that describes the context of where we're in, until finally, if I arrive at a communication screen, we get a URL that looks like this. Now a URL may look complex, but it's actually quite understandable, and we can look especially at the sets of name value pairs that are called the key values. And you can see here there's key 0, key 1, key 2, key 6, key 7, and this is all building up to this idea that CRM uses a concept of system context that allows it to keep track of what entities within the current session are being used. And this is really part of the state information that has to be contained within the URL that is then passed into the eWare DLL so that it can generate the pages and know where the user is within their interaction with CRM. The system is always going to be in the context of the current logged on user because we have a session ID, and as you view data within the system, it's that entity context that will change. So if we're on a person's summary screen, we'll be in the context of the user because we know who's logged on. We'll also be looking at the company and the person, because when we're looking at a person, that person belongs to a company, so we have that parental information in the context as well. Inside server-side scripts, that's the create, validate and table level scripts, and even workflow scripts, this context can be accessed via the CRM object, and we'll be looking in a moment how that's done. But let's remind ourselves of this URL. The URL may look complex, but it is understandable. So key 0, for example, here is something called the dominant key, and it always tells us the main current context. Key 1 contains the ID of the company. Key 2 contains the ID of the person. Key 6 contains the ID of the communication. Key 7 contains the ID of the opportunity. One of the things that we're always in context of is the current user. And we're always in the context of the current user, and there is an object provided called the current user object that allows us to access any data about the current logged on user. Let's have a look at the way in which we can use this. This is a very simple first create script. Here you can see that we're using the current user object. So it's showing also the use of system variables, valid and error string. Valid is, if you like, a flag that we can set to throw an error. So this script is going to check what team the current user is in, and if they're not in the sales team, and sales team has an ID of 1, then there'll be an error thrown, and then the error message that we've defined will be written to the screen. Now this is actually demonstrating the use of valid and error string that could be used for debugging purposes. I can add the script to the company name field inside the company box long screen, and if I then use this inside the interface, you can see that if I look at the company summary screen, because I'm logged on as a system administrator, and that's somebody inside the operations team and not inside the sales team, I get the hello world message. Now please note that the message displays in both view mode and edit mode. And this is because when you change the mode, you're actually sending another HTTP request to the server. Now, create scripts are run as the metadata for the screen is assembled, and that happens whenever a screen is requested. Now, if I click on the Save button, I'm going to be submitting this form to the system. And you can see that this is another HTTP request, so the create script fires again. And actually this is teaching us another important lesson. Create scripts, and you can hear these are using this for an informative rule displaying on here. Create scripts, however, cannot interrupt the commit process. And that means that create scripts are not going to block saves into the database. So you can't use create scripts for the definition of a restrictive rule. Can't be used for validation. So what you have essentially is an informative rule being used in the previous example, and here we have another example of an informative or warning rule. This particular set of code is going to tell the user that they're just about to do something that will be blocked if they continue to do it. So the idea is it's going to be coupled with the use of a validate rule. The code introduces here to us the idea of the CRM object and the get context info method. And you can see that what we're doing here is referencing the company that is in context and getting any of the data that's in context. So we've retrieved in this example, the company SLA ID field that holds the service level. If that field is null, then we can use the valid and error string system variables to trigger a warning on the screen. I've added the rule to the case reference ID fields create script within the case detail box screen. When a user starts to create a new case for a company, the message will warn the users that they're just about to run into a problem. The exact same script can be used within the validate script to block a commitment of the record. And we'll look at that in the lesson covering validate rules. And just as a note, this same rule could be created using the client-side API, and that's covered in other discussions elsewhere within the YouTube channel and also inside the community. I've been using objects like get context info. The Help Center has the API reference and the object reference for each of the versions that are supported, and the fields in screens are known as entry blocks or entries, and you'll be able to look within the developer guide to be able to access any of these properties and methods. If we consider some of these properties and methods in a little bit more detail, so far we've referenced information about the current user and the current context, but we've not changed any of the properties of the screen. But here you can see that we could set a default value for a field, and we could even make a field read-only or hidden, or we could change the caption that's displayed. I'm going to use this idea of captions in a moment, but just to give a sense of changing properties, I want to go back and think about coding in or rather implementing business rules in a non-code way. I've opened up here an administration screen, and I'm looking at the field security for one of the case fields. This happens to be the case SLA ID field. I could set a set of policies that control exactly who can see and change this data. You can see this is notice for everyone here. Everyone can read this and everyone can access this. So if you can access this particular record, which is a case record, then you should be able, and you have edit rights, then you'll be able to read and write into it. Now, this is a code-free approach for controlling permissions for fields in screens. But when you set a policy, you're able to do it for an individual user, you're able to do it for an individual team, you're able to do it for based on a security profile. But that's only interested in what this user is, not how that user combines with information about the entity that's in context. So the code-free approach can't cover all situations. So consider a rule. Only support team members can change a company SLA ID field when the company is of type customer. Now, this type of rule can only be implemented with a field level scripting rule. This happens to be the code that we would use. Here is the script that can access both the context of the data and the user. And I'm able to see the type of the company that I'm using, and I can also see that I can access the current user properties to check the team membership. Now, these both can be evaluated within the if statement, so if they both have to be true, and then the read-only property can be set. Okay. Now, there are other ways in which we can do this as well. So if we're working with create scripts, then we may want to look at the scope of reference to include environmental information. We know that we can access values in the URL that is for the record that is in context, and we've seen get context info to allow us to do that. But what about if we want to access some of the values that are responsible for drawing the screen? What action code has been used to load the screen, and what other information is available to us? Well, the values and form values methods allow us to access data in different circumstances, and may actually allow us to will allow us to get hold of different environmental information. So within a create script, here we're dealing with create script, the values collection is the values method is especially useful as we have read access to the data submitted by a form, and we have access to the variables contained within the URL, so we can see the submitted data. So the values method would allow us to read a URL and access not just the key values, but it also allows us to access the action code and other variables like mode, which would allow us to know exactly the circumstances which may trigger the code. And so if we have a think about a couple of examples, we can look at the screen and you can see here that I've added a new field into the table and it's called dummy. You can see that on the 4th line down. It's a text field. We're going to be using here the dummy field trick. It's a fairly standard trick within Sage CRM, and it also allows us to get access to properties of the fields like the caption. Now here, what I've done is I've added the dummy field into the company top contents screen, and I've added some script that changes the caption of the field. In usage, what we'd see is at the top right of the screen, I can see the count of opportunities and cases that exist for this company. Now, this is the code that did that work. Now, the code isn't too complex. Let's explain what we've done. It uses some methods that we've not seen before. First of all, find record. Now, find record retrieves the data from a table using the where clause as its second parameter. It returns as an object a record object. So var oppo record equals crm.find record. That find record returns a record object. So now oppo record is a opportunity record, and in the line below, case record is a case object. We've used get context info before, and we're here using get context info to build the where clause to allow us to get hold of the correct information. I've retrieved both the cases and opportunity records, so these are objects that we've used. But have you noticed that we're using the caption property? So this is scripted in the context of the create script. We don't need to put a this.caption or anything like that. Caption just knows that we're in the context of the field to be changed. The caption property here is being altered to add in some HTML. This HTML is building a table structure that will be responsible for presenting and laying out the retrieved information. And you'll notice that I'm styling here the cells using CSS classes. And it uses a method called getTrans to grab the correct translation from metadata. And I've also used a URL method to build the hyperlinks to the correct system action as well. So you'll notice that the system action 184 would be for the opportunity list. crm.url uses that action code. The value displayed is the record count property of the record object returned. So record count is another one of those documented things. All this information, all of these methods are documented, and you'll be able to look at those inside the guides. This is another trick. Now here you can see that I've used a create script to change the nature of a field. And I've changed the nature of the field by adding in an image field into the screen. I can upload an image for that person into their library, and then it's obviously displaying that. Now this is another dummy field trick, and this uses something called person image to give me access to the caption. In my case, in the screen person box long, I added a create script to the new field person image to cause it to display the picture instead of its normal caption. Now this script that we see here is longer, but it's not really harder. If you want to have a look at how this is done, there's actually a worked through example on the community, and you can download a component as well that will implement this change in the system. Now, my last note that as I talk through about create scripts is just to point out that create scripts can also be added to the columns that are included within list blocks. Same sorts of things can be done, but the properties are slightly different with the objects. Instead of entry objects, they are grid column objects, and there's some slight differences. The properties are different, but it does allow you to control the display of columns in grids and the changing sort order, etc. Please note that some of these properties are ignored within ASP pages when they come to be used, because you're using them in a different, you'd use a different technique to gradually build a list. Some of them don't make sense within an ASP extension environment. But here we have the field level scripting within the context of columns as well.